things. I want to introduce our first scene-setting speaker for scene-setting presentation. Dr. Nicola Ranger is joining us online. She's the director of the Global Finance and Economy Group at the Environmental Change Institute and Resilient Planet Finance Lab at Oxford University. She's also the executive director of the Oxford Martin Systematic Resilience Initiative and co-director of the UKRI Integrating Finance and Biodiversity Program. She has extensive experience, and if I went through the bio, it would take us half the session, but she's been involved in many of the large-scale signature initiatives in adaptation and resilience, bringing over 20 years of experience working with the World Bank, DFID, and now FCDO, financial institutions, central banks, ministries of finance, and others to strengthen the fiscal and financial resilience to climate and other crises and mobilize finance for adaptation. She recently co-authored Enabling Adaptation, Sustainable Fiscal Policies for Climate Resilient Development and Infrastructure. So we invited her to present some of the recommendations and findings from that work. Nicola, over to you. We see you, and I believe we will be able to hear you as well.
Hi there, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I hope that you can hear me okay.
Yes.
So
your presentation as well.
Thank you so much. So I'm just going to speak for 5 minutes and just give some of the headlines from the recent work that we did with UNEP. And I can see our collaborator, Himanshu, also on the line, who was a brilliant partner on this work. And really, this sort of picks up a number of the themes that we've just heard about in the introduction, and particularly this, mobilizing finance for adaptation is more than just about the money. And, an argument that we make in this piece is that ministries of finance are really playing the central role here, and this incredibly strong role that economic and fiscal policies can play in mobilizing investment, domestic capital, as well as international capital. So perhaps if you'd like to go to the next slide, please. And I'm just going to give a couple of highlights from the work rather than go through the whole study. But really, the motivator for this work was, obviously, we've got this adaptation financing gap that we've heard about, the growing of risks. But a key challenge is see a number of countries facing fiscal constraints, be them in the developing world or the high-income world, at a time of these growing risks. So how can we tackle both of these challenges together? If you go to the next slide, please. So really our key messages from this work were really trying to make that fiscal case for investing in adaptation. And some of the key messages are, so one is it's not all about blended finance. So we often, when we talk about how to mobilize more adaptation finance, we often come on to blended finance. And I will talk about that, but there's a lot more than that. This is about good policy. It's about setting the right incentives. And it's about the integration of climate into policy making across the board. So we particularly look at 4 areas, which I'll talk through briefly in this presentation. So the integration of adaptation across policy, particularly into diagnostics, risk management, financing strategies, the alignment of public spending with climate resilience goals, enabling societal action through setting clear goals and effective policy and information, and then finally the mobilization side through good planning, through engagement with the private sector, and also blended finance as well. And another really key message that we want to get across with this piece is this false dichotomy between debt sustainability, growth, and adaptation. These 3 objectives are fully aligned, and I'll show you some of the research that we've done in this area. If you go to the next slide, please. So I won't talk through all of this, but I will go through them in more detail in the coming slides. But really to emphasize these 4 key parts then. So the integration, the alignment, the enabling, and the mobilizing. And what I'll do now is just briefly have a sort of one set of slides, or one slide on each one of these, to give you the highlights of what that actually means in practice. And what we did in this study with UNEP was look at case studies for where this was working at different countries, and sort of pulled that together into this very sort of operational report that we prepared with UNEP. Go to the next slide, please. So firstly is this integration one. And one of the things we were very, very keen to do is look at this issue of debt and adaptation. And one of the concerns at the moment is that growing physical climate risks will threaten debt sustainability potentially in some countries, so increase fiscal risk to countries. And then that can hamstring countries in terms of being able to make the investments they need to make in adaptation through lowering sovereign credit ratings, increasing costs of capital, and then sort of reducing investment flows. So a lot of the report was looking at how do we break this cycle? How do we can investing in adaptation help to break this trap? And what kinds of adaptation can be most effective in doing that? So really this sort of fiscal case for adaptation. If you go to the next slide, please. So one of the case studies that we included in this work was in Southeast Asia. So actually looking at Thailand in the case that we have here. And what you can see, and to do this work, that we use the IMF's own models, using our own catastrophe risk modeling coupled into that. And what we can show is that increases in physical climate risk integrated into those macroeconomic models and debt sustainability models, you can see this increased risk of probability of default to countries and an increasing cost of debt with tropical cyclones and flood. And then through investing in adaptation, and this is sort of shown in this scenario 3, you can actually bring that risk down over the next couple of decades back to where it would be today or less through investing in cost-effective adaptation. So this really shows that why it's important to bring adaptation into our thinking about debt sustainability, into our macroeconomic modeling, to show this benefit of adaptation for growth, for resilience, for jobs in country, and for that long-term debt sustainability in a changing climate. If we move on to the next example. So the next piece that we talk about a lot in the report is the alignment of policy with adaptation goals. And this is going beyond just adaptation policy now. So it's looking across the board. And one of the studies we did a couple of years ago was tracking expenditure in the 3 years after the COVID pandemic started, to look at how that very large fiscal stimulus that went in over the COVID recovery period was supporting adaptation. And we looked across the world, so we looked at 90 countries. And what we found is that actually the amount of public spending that was aligned with adaptation was actually quite small. So you can see here the numbers in percentage terms. So for Europe, where I am now, about sort of 24% of it was aligned. For Africa, only about 10% of it was aligned. And what we also found is that if you look at the amount of spending that was potentially having a negative impact on adaptation, so things going into areas which were not resilient and could potentially make things worse, like infrastructure that was not built to cope with climate change, actually you can see around half of expenditure could be in this area of things that could be making things worse. So integrating that and setting a clear vision and clear goals and aligning fiscal policies with those goals is absolutely an essential part of bringing more finance into adaptation. Go to the next slide, please. And then the next bit is about setting the enabling environment. And I think this one, when we talk about mobilizing private finance, often doesn't get enough of a focus as it should. And I think we really need to start by looking at a sort of diagnostic of where is current policy, regulation, and financial architecture helping or hindering adaptation finance. And one of the examples that I've shown here is actually from Rwanda, which has a really interesting, very coherent set of policies that aim to create this enabling environment for green finance and adaptation finance overall, which goes right down from having sort of a clear vision and targets at a national level to its regulatory framework, through to things like developing taxonomy, to the funding mechanisms in place in a very coherent way. And what we see across countries is that this coherent approach, sort of thinking again, not just about the money, but that enabling environment for finance to flow is absolutely critical. And go to the next slide, please. So this is the final one then, which is on the mobilizing side. And I know we've got Jay who'll be speaking about mobilizing private investment in the next part, so I won't focus so much on this. But again, really, it's about, in a limited budget situation, thinking about how can we use the finance that is available, the public finance, to leverage the most private finance to where it's most needed. And what we see in successful examples in countries is where there's this clear collaboration between the public and private sector to set the investment plans for adaptation, identify where those gaps are, identify what should be public and what's private, and where is there a rationale for bringing in some public finance through blended finance mechanisms to stimulate those private investments. If you go to the next slide, please. So just to again sum up then, so really this work is trying to set this operational framework for thinking about the role of fiscal policy in adaptation. It really sort of shows that it isn't all about public spending. It's about looking at how can you use that limited scarce public funds most effectively to mobilize the most private investment into adaptation. And we lay out a framework to do that. And then really importantly, picking up this false dichotomy between debt sustainability, growth, and adaptation. Investing adaptation is about growth. It's about sustainability of debt in the long run. And these things are totally aligned. And I'll finish there. Thank you so much.